Hello, everyone, and welcome to LabStats Tech Talk. I'm Derrick Hirschi, Customer Success Manager here at LabStats, and I'm joined today by Houston Griffith, Senior Manager for Labs and Classroom Computing at Virginia Commonwealth University. He and his team maintain and support academic computing for computer labs, conference rooms, and laptops. Thank you for being here, Houston. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Derek. Thank you for having me.
Good. Yeah, no problem. No problem. I've got a number of different topics here I'd like to go over with you. We've got lab management, we've got COVID-19, we've got LabMan conference. Um, to start, can we lead in with how you got your start in computer lab management?
Sure. So I actually started my career in IT way back in like 2005. But fast forward a few years to 2010, I was attending as a student at Virginia Tech, and I applied for a position with the College of Architecture and Urban Studies. And as a lot of people I work with at VCU, got my start as a student worker. So
Hmm.
I was responsible for a small computer lab there. And then we had some other kiosk style computing at a few of the other off campus departments. And that's really where I got my start with computer lab management in general in sort of the higher ed industry. Um, from there, I was at Virginia Tech for a few years, and then I transitioned to a role here at Virginia Commonwealth University, managing all of the central computer labs and classrooms for the university on both campuses. We have two campuses, our Monroe Park campus, which is our academic campus, and our Medical College of Virginia campus, which is tied to our hospital system, VCU Health. And just to be clear, during this interview, I'm giving my own opinions. Um, Anything that I say is not representative of what Virginia Commonwealth University would be representing.
Perfect. Understood. Thank you. So let's move into the future of lab management. Let's starting, we're going to talk about the future, start with the past a little bit here. Can you walk us through how your work has changed over the course of the career you've just shared with us?
Sure. So, like I mentioned, I started in a part-time role as a student employee at Virginia Tech, and looking back over a decade ago to where I'm at now, a lot of what we did a decade ago is either completely irrelevant or very much on its way out. um, some of the big things that have changed, I think, are to do with how we're providing services to students now. Certainly, with the impact of the pandemic, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more later. You
Yeah.
know, the traditional mindset of provide X, Y, and Z to students has changed a bit. So, from my view, how my work has changed over the course of my career thus far. For me, it's also kind of looking at the scope and how narrow and small the scale was when I started out, having supported just a single school with a few departments, and over the years, as I've progressed in my career, now to managing basically services to support classroom technology and computing for an entire university, multiple campuses. There's a shift away, I think, from doing things at that smaller scale and thinking more about the big picture. And now beyond that, not just managing systems, but also people as well. So for me, that's been one way that a couple of ways that my work has changed over time.
And so in the last, decade or however long it's been you've been doing this, what tools were you using, say, a decade ago that you're not using now? You mentioned a lot of it's changed. What are some of the things that you don't utilize anymore?
So the ones that come to mind are tools like Norton Ghost. That was an imaging tool that we used
Oh, yeah, okay.
years ago, and I'm sure that a lot of the listeners here are probably familiar with Ghost.
Certainly.
That whole concept of create this base image or golden image and then deploy it to systems, either lab computers, laptops, whatever. That has really a lot of the practice has shifted away from that sort of concept into just install a base operating system and then layer things on top of it.
Yeah, using a mass deployment tool of some kind.
Exactly. So I think a lot of higher ed institutions have now shifted their focus away from that, or at least IT organizations within higher ed have shifted their focus away from doing things that way towards more of a, I guess you could say, scripted approach. And that's sort of a double entendre there. Scripted as in the sense that they're actually writing code like PowerShell or Visual Basic, or hopefully not Visual Basic script anymore, but PowerShell and things like Python, to be able to automate a lot of that
Yeah.
deployment process.
Yeah. Automation of these tools is huge now.
Yeah, so that, but also this in the sense that they're thinking about what does the deployment workflow look like from ordering all the way through receiving, and preparing a device for deployment, to handing it off to an end user, to getting it back and retire it. So the concept of lifecycle management, there's tools that can help do a lot more of that rather than just laying down a base image or installing applications. So like, for example, some of the tools that we've kind of transitioned into are things like Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager, which is formerly known as System Center Configuration Manager for Windows devices. And then for Mac devices, Jamf Pro is another one that we're using. So we've kind of shifted away from that idea of using something like Ghost to create that big monolithic, thick image, if you will, to
And
this streamlined approach.
and it's a lot more customizable now, with you don't have to have specific images for specific labs anymore. You can just say, yep, you need this, you need this, you need this, you don't need that. And it's just that easy to have a more unique software footprint, you might call it.
Yeah, and that we've seen that a lot. What we used to do was, even when I started at VCU in 2014, we were still sort of in that let's create a base image mindset, and everybody at VCU was still doing very much that same practice. But over the years, since we've implemented MECM and Jamf, in some ways we've been given a choice, and in other ways we've been forced to adopt this new method where we find that installing all of the software packages we have available into a base image, it's not really necessary. Sure, it's kind of, like a broad stroke, just cover everybody with every piece of software, but that's not really efficient.
Gets costly real quick.
And it gets costly, that's right. So, measuring that software usage obviously is, something that we want to be able to do. And we don't need to deploy every piece of software everywhere. So that's another aspect of it.
So we've kind of gone over how this has changed, your ability to do your work. It's easier to get to have more granular control, I suppose you might say, over what's available. What are some of the nuances of your work that have become more important to you over the last few years? Primary concerns as a lab management professional, they change and everything. What problems do you face on a daily basis, and how do you solve them?
For me, at least, I think it's, again, kind of going back to what I mentioned earlier. When I started out in higher ed, I was just a student worker and I was part-time. So for me, the level of impact of my decision making was very small.
Yeah.
It was very localized. It was very isolated. It was one school that I was supporting and serving as backup for a larger college. But, fast forward to today, for me, a lot of the decision making is based around, we have to take into consideration potentially every student, faculty, and staff member who may end up using a tool or service or piece of software or a computer lab. So for me, it's also trying to think of all those different angles that we might get questions about. Well, can I use this piece of software in this computer lab or on this laptop? And on a daily basis, I would say, some of the biggest issues or challenges that we're trying to solve for have to do with, the logistics of managing those services at that university scale. So certainly I'm not alone in that regard. There are plenty of other excellent people who work at VCU, both in the Central Technology Services Group and within the schools and colleges. And, our focus is really on trying to understand what the needs of faculty and students and staff are and try and address those as best we can. But for me, at least, I think the biggest change has been that impact or that scale at which things are happening.
So how do you keep track of, let's say the needs of this building versus that building, or even this floor of this building versus the lower floor? Like you said, you have to kind of understand who's going to be using these machines, whether faculty or students or staff. How do you keep track of all that information?
Yeah, so a lot of it comes down to like our work with different departments what software they're going to need for their computer lab versus another. So just as an example, we use a service management type of approach for some of our customers who they have classrooms that are not what we can consider centrally supported, which means, it's the department's responsibility to fund things like service, hardware, communicate the availability of those resources to their students. It's not managed as a central resource. So even though my team does manage all of our central classrooms and computer labs, we also have these non-central customers. So, one way we do that is with that agreement, and, we're basically kind of spelling out, all right, here's what we provide, here's what your needs are, or what you've told us your needs are. And, here's how we kind of go about approaching whatever challenge you have and solving it with something that we can do within, the scope of what services we're offering.
So kind of a joint effort then, working with the departments or with the people who are kind of more in charge there and saying, we provide these things, you want this stuff, that's up to you.
Right. And it's always sort of a give and take. There's always some level of negotiation on what
right.
we are being asked to do versus what we're able to actually do. So, in some cases, it comes down to, all right, well, we can procure the hardware and we can set it up for you, but there may be something that you need to do on your side to either assist your students or your faculty in getting them that additional support they need. One of the big things we've been dealing with recently is we're working with our School of Medicine to find a creative solution for their exam and testing events. And that's the sort of example where, you've got a bunch of different programs for people who are going to be physicians very soon. And they need to be able to take this really, high stakes examination. So we've been trying to set up an agreement with them where they can just simply, reach out to us and provide some very basic information. We can get the software that they need from their accreditation board, install it, certify it, make sure it's good to go, and then the students can actually take their exam. So it's a lot of it to me is less on the technical side of things and more on, the logistics. How do we actually communicate that this service is, this is what the service that we're providing covers, and the things that we're doing versus the things we're not able to do.
Well, and not to mention managing the testing environment, making sure that there's, limiting opportunities for something like cheating or things like that. There's a lot of factors that would go into that require a lot of coordination, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's kind of going back to the, what are our responsibilities as a service provider and what are the customer responsibilities. And we're providing that tool for them to use, or that toolbox of tools. And, it's really their job to actually pick the tools up and use them. So that's kind of the way that I view the relationship from my point of view.
Interesting. Let's change tracks here a little bit. Let's talk a bit about the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you, once again, let's start at the beginning. Can you walk us through the first few weeks of the pandemic at VCU? What were the action items? What emergent items needed to be addressed, and how did you navigate those?
So it was sort of a scramble, as I'm sure it was.
That'd be like, you're telling me.
We were actually in the middle of spring break when that announcement came down, and the university's first action, I believe, was to limit in-person classes. And basically what we did was we sort of transitioned from this model of, we've got all these projects in the pipeline, and we've got all of these tickets that we're still working on for classroom or computer lab issues, to stop, drop everything, do nothing but prepare loaner laptops.
Yeah, they didn't matter anymore. You gotta fix these desktops. No one's gonna use them.
Exactly. So, we reached out to a few of our departments that we had been working with through the service agreements I mentioned, and they had laptop cards. A few of them did offer to donate their laptops to us temporarily. So that was great. We had the ability to prepare more laptops to meet the demand from students who actually needed them. And, we continued that program even through today. We're still loaning laptops. So
did you guys have enough for those early days?
No. We had to reach out to, those other departments. We did purchase some Chromebooks, but what we found is that initially, we were, we had, I think, around 60 or 70 laptops to begin with. And, that just wasn't enough to meet the demand, because
that doesn't sound like very many.
No, it wasn't. A lot of them were already checked out, and
Hmm.
We had students who just held on to them, and we told them that's okay, go ahead and keep them. But the students who didn't have one, we only had really, I think, 2 days of on campus actual support available, and then from there it was just everything transitioned to shipping. So we were literally, taking requests in, triaging. Our IT support center, our help desk folks, they helped us immensely with triaging and checking eligibility requirements and all these other things.
It's unheard of what everybody had to do just to get by. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about loaner laptops. That's something you guys are still doing. Are there any other challenges you guys needed to address to accommodate students? Did you have other ways of getting resources to students other than these loaner laptops?
Yeah. So one of the bigger things that we've been kind of working on in the background is this idea of solving for, software delivery, um, not just for the BYOD side of things, the bring your own device.
Hmm.
That concept that students bring their own laptop and the university is in some way able to deliver software to those devices. We're not just trying to solve for that. It's also, we realize that, sometimes a laptop isn't just isn't going to cut it. No matter how powerful it is, you may need a workstation class desktop computer.
Right.
And sometimes there's a good option for cloud for virtual desktops to be able to do that. But in a lot of cases, it requires remote access to an actual desktop computer. We have one scenario with that for a department that we support under a service agreement where their students need to be able to run things like ArcGIS and City Engine and Photoshop and Illustrator and some of these other tools that they're using. And um, their laptops, either they may not have a laptop that supports that software. So for example, with tools like ArcGIS, they may not be able to run it on a MacBook
Right.
or a Chromebook. So they need to be able to access that computer lab remotely. Um, and we are using LabStats for that. So
Okay.
we're using that tool to be able to enable them to solve that need.
And so the interesting thing, and this is something that I've said in a few different tech talks, I've said it to a number of different people, is that a lot. I personally, I feel like a lot of students are going to look at this and go, "Hang on, this whole remote school thing worked just fine. Why can't we just keep doing this?" Do you think some of these changes were things that were going to happen anyways? Or do you think the pandemic was kind of really the catalyst for a lot of this stuff that really wouldn't have happened otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that some of these things were, on their way to uh, more full exploration of the challenges and what solutions would be needed to solve them well before the pandemic. So, for example, we saw the increased demand for loaner laptops well before the pandemic began. And in terms of how we're providing that service, obviously we had to kind of think up a new way to do that when
Yeah.
the university had closed. But now that we are open again, we're kind of going back and I guess reevaluating and adjusting some of the offerings to meet students where they are. And we realize that there's going to be some cases where, for example, a student simply can't come to campus because they live too far away, and it would
Right.
take them hours to get to campus, or maybe they live with someone who is immunocompromised, and for them it would be putting that person at unnecessary risk. So there's cases where we have to deal with that sort of thing and adjust our services to better meet those needs.
Hmm.
And beyond that, there's certainly other cases as well. So software is certainly a big one. I think that's a big software delivery specifically. I think is a big challenge for a lot of universities right now.
Yeah.
Um,
Do you think this pandemic? Do you think the changes, like I was saying earlier, do you think these changes are kind of permanent in a way? I mean, it's like we see nationwide. We see people are now calling. Well, work from home has worked wonderfully for us. No need to go back to the office. Do you think there's going to be a similar movement for students on campus or off campus? Maybe as the case may be.
I think there's the potential for some of these changes to become permanent, but I think it's going to be more, instead of an industry-wide trend, I do think that some of it is going to come down to what the culture of that particular institution is. If the
Mm,
culture is very
okay.
hands-on, then they may return to in-person learning. But if there's a good case to be made that students can learn effectively from home or remotely with maybe a less of a focus on in-person learning. I think that's definitely a possibility. Um, I myself don't have obviously any authority to call, but at the same time, I do think that in some ways students might end up looking at that as an opportunity to kind of assess, all right, well, maybe if I wasn't able to attend this school because it's out of state, and for me having to be there in person is not an option. But if I can, learn online, opening up those online learning resources so that students can attend other schools remotely and get their degree online, I think that's definitely something that schools will likely look at in the future, is the expanded presence of online only learning. We started to see that, I think, with a lot of schools before the pandemic began, but now I think the pandemic has accelerated
Yeah.
the desire by students to be able to learn online.
And it's interesting, when you say, you're not an expert and not necessarily the guy to listen to make predictions, but you're definitely the one who has to support it if that's the way that things decide to go.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, what we're trying to do, I think, is temper what we're able to provide in terms, not just from a technical point of view, but also there's always this sort of, I guess, balancing act of, you have the funding to be able to provide a technical solution, but do you have the support staff from the logistics point of view to be able to actually support it?
Can you maintain it? You're right.
Exactly.
So you mentioned that that your campus was open again. Was that my understanding, or did I misunderstand?
We actually returned to in-person learning on some in-person learning and hybrid classes on March 4th.
Oh, so just like this last week then?
Yeah.
What did the return to campus plans look like as you guys were gearing up for that, and what's the plan going forward?
Well, I'm not really authorized to talk about the return to campus plans. That would have to come from our university relations.
Oh, okay, understood.
From my team's point of view, it was trying to prepare to make sure that classrooms, the computers in the classrooms were in good working order, and making sure that we were still keeping up with the requests that we were getting for loaner laptops, for Adobe licenses and things like that.
Okay. Do you think we've touched on this just a little bit? Do you plan on retaining some of these programs? You mentioned loaner laptops, some of these other things, remote access, for example, or VMs you might have set up. Do you plan on retaining these long term, do you think?
I think there is definitely a chance that we'll retain some of the unique kind of agreements that we've made with certain schools that we support. How that gets implemented long term, I think there's definitely going to be a need to review how we operate, and certainly there's going to be I think a shift in strategy to how we do some things. For example, I keep mentioning software delivery. That's a big one that we're thinking about now. And I mean, I think what I would like to see is us be able to expand on some of those service offerings, but at the same time, my concern is, how are we going to do that in the future? Is it going to be, that we go entirely one direction or entirely the other, or is it going to be more of a kind of meet in the middle approach? And I think that it's likely going to end up being that meet in the middle approach.
Yeah. Yeah. So speaking of long term, what do you think the next 5 to 10 years look like as far as the lab management space goes? Just if you were to give your thoughts on, like I said, the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. I think once we get past the pandemic and we're 5 to 10 years down the road, it's kind of hard to predict what a computer lab is going to look like 10 years from now. I mean,
Right.
10 years ago, it would have been very easy to predict what a computer lab of 2021 would look like. I mean, it still to this day kind of looks very much the same as it did 10 years ago. But now that there's such an increased focus on, some of these things that we're doing during the pandemic, like physical distancing, and, dealing with capacity issues.
Virtualization,
right. I think that there's going to be some shifts in how computer lab management is thought of in the traditional sense of buy computers, put them in a room, hook them up, load software on them, allow students to use them, or, give students access to them. I think that traditional model may shift to more of a, let's demonstrate the need for these systems based on demand, and let's find out if that is the best solution moving forward. It may or may not be. I mean, there's certainly, I had this conversation with a colleague earlier today. I think there's always going to be a component of, there being a physical computer lab that students access either remotely or in person.
Right.
And I think the reason for that is pretty simple. Right now, it's still, in a lot of ways, it can be cheaper if you have very, high requirements for performance. Like, for example, if you need to be able to render video or, anything in 3D, it may be cheaper for you just to buy, a set of workstations for that computer lab and give students access to them, rather than trying to do that with a cloud solution, or a VDI solution for that matter. So there's some use cases, I think, where we're always going to have in-person or physical computer labs that people access that way. But I think
Right.
there is going to be, for the more generalized lab computing, a higher focus placed, or a bigger focus placed on students having a device of their own that can meet most of those requirements. And for the ones that they can't, the university being able to provide some of those additional resources.
Or where the licensing is limited.
Or where the licensing is limited. Yeah, that's another use case where, you may have this really esoteric kind of software license agreement with a vendor, and you don't have a choice, but to just install that software on those computer lab systems. And then the only way you can provide that is in person. You may not have a choice.
And as we were going back and forth too, so you mentioned something in some of our materials as we were getting ready for this interview. You talked about a classic pick true triangle, with the criteria being, you have cost, quality, and simplicity, and you can only pick two. And I thought that was an interesting take on it.
Yeah, it's one of I think those sort of strange mental models we use to think about things in terms of administering that type of support to students. Like, you're exactly right. You get to pick two of the three, not all three. And often it's, in some cases, one of your choices may even be degraded from, full support. So, you have to drastically simplify something, or you have to drastically reduce the cost, or find a way to do it cheaper, or, you have to drastically improve quality of a solution, or many of those things. And finding that balance, I think, is always a challenge. But, the other thing that strikes me as something we're going to see in the future is a lot more flexibility in terms of how a lot of these computer lab solutions are being leveraged, especially with that shift to online. At least for VCU, we saw almost all of our student body shift within a couple of weeks, and our faculty to using Zoom. I'm not going to be the first person to say it was easy, because I don't have the direct experience like faculty and students. But, from what I saw, there was this sort of immediate shift from in-person to online. And if we had not had a solution to do that, we wouldn't have been yielded the flexibility to be able to continue offering classes. And I'm not even sure where VCU would be, or many other universities would be, without the ability to do this online learning through tools like Zoom and Microsoft Teams and those other tools that are allowing that.
Well, and it was kind of interesting. I was in a similar situation, at least with I have two kids that are in elementary school, and all of a sudden it was like, okay, we're doing school from home over Zoom, and it was like, I've got a kid in kindergarten, right? How do you do kindergarten over Zoom? But everybody just kind of had to figure it out because there wasn't another choice.
Yeah, absolutely.
So jump in. Let's pandemic aside. We've talked a little bit about how students' needs are changing before the pandemic. Let's say, outside of it, what direction, like we said, you were kind of moving in that loaner laptop direction. You were kind of moving in the direction of providing things to students rather than providing a location for them to go to. If that's how it was before the pandemic, and that's we've definitely sped up going that direction now. Has that, I wouldn't necessarily say that's changed, other than it's just going faster.
Yeah, I think that's true. There's definitely to me at least, it feels like we have sort of made this, uh, I guess you could say it's sort of a realization that we've made a shift from what we've done traditionally to, having to figure out how to do this in a way that allows us to continue to be flexible on delivery of, learning, technology, what have you. And the technology resources piece is one that I would kind of like to focus on, just because, if students don't have access to those tools, what does that say about their path in terms of finishing their degree or finishing their course of study? And, if they have to go and kind of figure that out for themselves, certainly there's always a case to be made that, there's some things the university just can't provide. We can't solve necessarily for every single need, but at the same time, could we at least provide guidance? Even if we can't buy the software, can we provide a pathway for students to buy that software? Or for example, if we can't provide them a laptop, can we at least partner with hardware vendors and manufacturers to obtain, a discount at the university level for them to be able to buy it at a discounted rate? So that's the sort of that's the kind of programming I'm thinking of is, is it reasonable to expect that a student comes to a university and, they automatically get handed a laptop with all the software that they need already installed on it, ready to go, and, they don't have to do anything? I don't think that's reasonable necessarily to assume that that's going to happen, but, is that something to aim for? Certainly.
Well, the interesting thing that strikes me that as you talk about, can we provide these things? What can we provide? And if we can't, how do we go about helping in another method? But there are colleges out there, there are universities out there that may be taking this exact thing. You kind of end up with a traditional problem of, all right, can we do this? And if we can't, will students, maybe they'll go find what they want somewhere else. A student who doesn't want to go on campus may find that there are colleges that are maybe more equipped or more positioned to offer that kind of thing. So that has to be a consideration as well, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I think that's to the competitive in speaking to the competitive nature of higher education,
Yeah.
students choosing their school, where they want to attend, where they want to finish their degree. Um, I'm not sure that that is necessarily criteria that they were looking at before the pandemic, but I think it will be in the future. And I think it's something that speaks volumes to how we provide services to students now versus what we're planning to do in the future. Certainly there's a greater emphasis placed on some of that material technology support that we're doing, not just in helping students get, the device that fits their course of study or their needs best, but also, the after the fact kind of support. So are they going to a computer lab, but finding out that it doesn't have the software that they actually need to run, or that, in trying to find where that software is available in a computer lab, that it's not even available for them to download themselves for their own laptop.
Right. Is there a good way to tell them where they can find it?
Exactly.
Even if that's just, this software is available here on campus, something like that.
Yeah, and I think that that's going to continually be a challenge, but I don't know that students are going to, get as specific to a piece of software to say, oh, I'm going to choose this school over another because
Well,
they
right.
offer. But it may be more in line with their thinking about adding that overall technology, resource availability as something they think about when choosing a school.
Exactly.
That might definitely happen, I think.
So are there any student requests or use cases that surprise you? As you're working through all these different situations, anything come up and you're like, wow, I never thought about that before.
At this point, not really.
Seen it all, huh?
Yeah, well, we don't really get that many crazy requests, to be honest with you. It's
Ah,
more that we see some of the trends shifting over time. Like a decade ago, VCU student population was primarily using Windows laptops, and I think it was almost like 2/3. Nowadays, it's 2/3 MacBooks,
that's
and
interesting.
it's a really interesting shift. I don't know if a lot of that is driven by consumer behavior trends, and I guess you could say people shifting from one side of the preference spectrum to the other in terms of whether they want to use a Windows device, a Mac OS device, not a laptop at all. Like maybe they just want to use their phone or a tablet. So I
Right.
mean, I think it's there's definitely expansion of choices. When I was a student many many years ago at Virginia Tech, we were basically told buy this, and there wasn't really much in the way of the ability to factor in personal preference. So I don't know if that's necessarily so much a surprise as it is. I see the trend moving much more in a direction where I guess you could say we're trying to be flexible, more flexible with what technology needs students have, but also,
Right.
to me, the biggest surprise is, that shift in the overall preference of end users from one operating system to another. I mean, what is that because we have more students who just simply prefer a MacBook to a Windows laptop, or is there something else at play there?
And that kind of speaks to the answer of my next question a bit. Was how you anticipate students' needs changing in the future. We kind of talked about that a bunch already, where you're saying, delivering things in some of these different methods to make sure the students can get what they need or what they want in a way that makes sense given the technology that they have now.
Yeah, and in trying to, I guess, understand how that's going to change in the future, even more. I don't know. I mean, to me, it seems like there's several different things at play there. So a big one being, a lot of software vendors, I think, are catching on to this idea that their product as a service or their product as a subscription, that certainly maybe factors into how universities do software management or software license compliance or, even software delivery itself. Getting
As much as we might shake our heads and be like, "Oh my goodness, not another subscription."
everything as a subscription, right?
Everything. Can we do this as a live service? No, please stop. Let's jump tracks again here to a different topic. Let's talk a little bit about LabMan, because I know you guys are you're one of the organizers at the host university for the next one. VCU's host university for the next LabMan. What should attendees expect as you're gearing up for, hopefully this time, the actual conference itself?
Yeah, I think from day one, when we got that call that we would be hosting LabMan, this was back in June of 2019.
That was
We
a long time ago.
It
Oh
was a
my
long time
goodness.
ago.
That feels like forever
It
ago.
does. And we got that call, and we said, "Great, we're happy to host." And then, this time last year, as we were kind of preparing for the final stages of putting things together and communications, the pandemic started, and it changed everything. We had to reschedule, but one thing it didn't change is, our vision for the LabMan conference has always been the same, in that we want attendees to feel as if it's the same LabMan that they've always attended, but with maybe some new things thrown in there to kind of spice things up a bit. We were forced to reschedule 3 times now. So
Yeah.
initially we rescheduled to fall of 2020, and then we rescheduled to May of this year, 2021. And then, most recently, kind of given where we're at with vaccinations in the US, we just made the decision at this point, we're not going to be able to get to that quote unquote herd immunity. And it's not going to be a good place for us to be able to keep people safe. And, so we made that call to say, let's go ahead and reschedule and push it out another year. But we're
So we're
still
talking 2022 then, summer of 2022?
Yeah, so we rescheduled for June of 2022.
Okay.
And ironically, June was kind of where we wanted when we wanted to host the conference originally, and we got that feedback from a lot of attendees and several past sponsors who said June works better for us. Unfortunately, at the time when we got that call in the first week of June, I believe it was. At the time, the Illinois Institute of Technology was hosting LabMan, and during that week, I mean, the first thing we did within 24 hours was book space. and we had to find dates that were not only number one available, but number two didn't conflict with Richmond's yearly sort of annual schedule. Now that annual schedule within the city is kind of disrupted,
Yeah.
we have a lot more options available to us. So like, for example, for the June 2022 dates, we were able to get back the venue that we wanted originally, which is our own library on our Monroe Park campus. And we were able to get the week of dates that's very close to what we wanted originally. So towards the middle of June. Unfortunately, it's a little bit past that, but it's still in June. So those are the dates that we originally wanted. When we first planned the conference, or when we first selected dates in 2019, nothing in June was available. So we had
Yeah. And now everyone's like, please, you want to schedule something? Take it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the thing, is we looked at, all of our options, and we said, this is going to give us the time. And I almost feel like in a lot of ways, it's a bit unfair for VCU to have said, we're going to reschedule again, just because at that point we will have had over 3 years to plan this conference.
It better be perfect.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of what I'm getting at. The expectations are high, but I want attendees to understand that we're not trying to drastically necessarily alter the course of what the LabMan conference is really about or how it's experienced. Our format is going to remain pretty much the same. The big differences, I think, are going to be in some of the newer things that we're trying to do.
Right. And so actually jumping off of that, what's something along those lines you'd like attendees of past LabMans to understand about this one? It's obviously going to be different, but what do you want people to know about it?
I think the big thing for me is just that attendees understand we're not planning this conference in a vacuum in the context of the pandemic or COVID-19. We're in the same boat as everyone else with regard to conferences and, social gatherings and other types of events. And, we're still working to make sure that there's a great mix of presentations, workshops, social events. So we're still doing all of the same things that we would be, doing to plan a conference. It's just, there's some additional things we have to do to make sure attendees remain safe. And of course, we've all been over this at this point. It's been a year since the pandemic has started. So those are the things like, physical distancing, making sure we have capacity for the crowd itself, for the number of attendees we have, face coverings and masks, the things that we are not only required to do, but, from my point of view, it's more of a sort of safe but social initiative, and that's what we're trying to kind of aim for is we all want to come together in this in-person event, but there's some things that everybody has to do so that everybody can stay safe.
Okay. And what's something that you want new attendees or people who have never been to know about LabMan?
We're not just for computer lab managers, even though that is kind of what LabMan stands for. It stands for lab management or lab managers. It's a group where our focus is primarily on managing computer labs, academic computer labs. There's been tons of other topics covered at LabMan in the past, not only in keynotes, but also plenty of other presentations by folks who work at universities who are managing computer labs, but also may have moved into a different position and are now managing something else. So for us, it's not just solely focused on computer labs. One of the ways in which I'm trying to kind of help us branch out is to kind of blend some of the experiences that we have with the folks that we work with in the audiovisual space. Like for my team especially, we work daily with our audiovisual team, our media support services group.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of overlap. So they have podiums in our classrooms that have a lot of AP equipment that interface with the computer that we manage. And there's computer labs where they have similar types of setups. And, we've got these flipped classrooms and active learning spaces where there's a ton of technology that's blended in such a way that, they sort of hold the responsibility of making sure that the audiovisual side works. My team makes sure that the computing side works. And together we are able to create this, great mix of technology that's available to people to use. So that's something that I've seen, a pathway to to get more people interested in what we're doing, but also potentially to kind of mix up some of the content that's being presented at LabMan in the future.
So we've talked a bit about how COVID impacted LabMan specifically, but how do you think that live events might change going forward? Since you guys have been working on this, do you think landscape of live events is now fundamentally different from what it used to be? After years without live events, trade shows, conferences, whatever else, how, is there anything specific you're thinking about that as an event organizer?
Well, it's kind of hard to predict what that's going to look like in the future. Everything is still kind of in flux at the moment.
Yeah.
So for me, I think the big thing is to take away from that is, in-person events themselves, I think, are totally different than virtual events. And what I mean by that is, if you're in an in-person event, you have more opportunities to strike up conversation, casually with other attendees. And you might have even more opportunities for engagement with attendees, sponsors, other people who are at the event. And